Welcome to the Clinician's Corner, the go-to podcast for functional health practitioners who want to deepen their clinical skills and deliver exceptional client results. I'm your host, Margaret Floyd Barry, Master Restorative Health Practitioner and Executive Director of the Institute of Restorative Health. Each week, I interview leading experts to bring you the latest research, case studies, and evidence-based strategies for reversing chronic disease with actionable insights you can implement immediately to elevate your practice and transform how you deliver health. Hello, everybody. I am so excited for today's conversation. We have, I think, this is only our second time we've had a repeat guest. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but this is Dr. Aimie Apigian, who was with us in the early days of this podcast. And this is going to be such a fantastic conversation. Let me introduce you to Dr. Aimie in case you don't know who she is. She is a trainer, speaker, and physician, double board certified in preventative and addiction medicine with a master's degree in biochemistry and public health. Beyond her conventional medical and surgical training, Dr. Aimie has training in psychosomatic medicine, functional medicine, and mental health nutrition. Her extensive training in trauma therapies, including the instinctual trauma response model, somatic experiencing, neuroaffective touch, and relational trauma repair with psychodrama, have formed her knowledge and services in attachment, trauma, and addictions, focusing on trauma at a cellular level, which is something we're going to talk a lot about today. Dr. Aimie is also the host of the Biology of Trauma podcast. She has spoken at Oxford University, the Institute for Functional Medicine, Psychotherapy Innovations, Integrative Medicine for Mental Health, and she's been featured on the Trauma Therapist Project, Therapy in a Nutshell, the Healing Trauma podcast, and more. You can find her on YouTube, Instagram, or her website, which is traumahealingaccelerated.com. She is also, she doesn't mention it here in her bio, but she is the author of the soon-to-be-released book coming out September 23rd, The Biology of Trauma, which I have had the absolute delight of reading, and we're going to dive into this today. Dr. Aimie, welcome back to your second appearance on the podcast.
Thank you, Margaret. It's always lovely to see you and to be with you. I think you're one of my favorite people in the world. And I'm just like, oh, whenever I get time with Margaret, of course I'm going to say yes. And when I sent you my book manuscript and then I didn't hear back, I was like, oh no. What does she think of my book? And I know that I shouldn't care what you think about my book, but I do care about what you think about my book because I love you so much.
Well, I gotta say, I'm gonna say to everyone here what I said to you beforehand, which is that I am just blown away. I'm really picky about books. I read a lot of books. And I have read a lot in this space already, right? Like, when the body says no, the body keeps score, like these books that are really talking about like the physiological manifestations of trauma. And I really believe firmly that your book, The Biology of Trauma, is going to be, already is, and the world is about to find out, one of the seminal books like this in understanding the trauma response. It fills such an important gap. I know we're going to talk about this, but I'm just going to go spoiler alert. All y'all who are listening to this live or the recording afterwards, you must get this book. You've done a really outstanding job of it. We're going to unpack some of the pieces, but I just want, the lack of response was simply a busy mode. So isn't that a good lesson for all of us, that I know we can take these things sometimes so personally and read into it, while meanwhile I'm sitting there reading the book going, oh my God, look at what she's done. So
and this is one way in which our body still holds trauma patterns, is that it makes stories up. Stories about whether people will like us or not if they know the real us. And this, I feel like in this book, I put the real me in this book.
You did.
And so it does feel vulnerable to put it out in the world where there's a lot of critics.
Yeah, well, you did a fantastic job, and I'm really excited for the world to get this. The world needs this. So what I would love to do is start off, you start the book by sharing your story as an adoptive mom and how this launched you into your fascination and study with trauma. So can you share a little bit more about this moment and how it was such a turning point for you?
Margaret, I thought I knew trauma. I mean, I had always cared for kids who were hurting, and I'd been like a big sister in the Big Brother, Big Sister program. And so when I had some time between the end of my master's in biochemistry and going back into third year of medical school, I was like, well, let me be a foster parent. It was never intended to become permanent and for me to adopt. The intention for me at that time was just to foster parent, because that was how I saw I could make a difference with my time and be meaningful in the world. And when they placed Miguel with me, that's what changed everything. Because he had been in the foster care system since age 9 months. He was then 4. And what they were telling me was that he was so severe in his behaviors that he could not be placed in any other home that had children or pets, which left me as a single mom being the perfect placement for him. And I went into it still with this idea of, I know what to do. I know that kids who have been hurt, all they need is love. You give them love, you give them that stability, that security, and with time, they'll rise above their past. I could not have been more wrong. And so I start my book with a story that I often share when I'm also speaking at conferences, where I'm in a rocking chair and I'm holding him. He's in my lap. We're looking into each other's eyes. And for me, it felt out of the blue. I had no expectation that this is even what he was thinking as I'm sitting there pouring love into his eyes. And his words were, "Mommy, I'm going to kill you tomorrow. Not today, tomorrow, Mommy." And he was 5 at the time. And it stunned me. It shocked me. It hurt. But it started this deep dive into trauma. And it started with understanding attachment, because that's where I felt his wounds had been. So that's where I should start. How do I repair his attachment? How do I even understand why he would say such a thing? And Margaret, why he would attempt to kill me. Right. And so that then led from one thing to the next. And I ended up going into surgery residency thinking that that was what I was meant to do in this world. And 4 years in, had my own experience with now my own trauma catching up with me. And it had become my own biology. And that also had happened underneath the surface. And I hadn't even realized what was happening until one morning I couldn't get out of bed. And diagnosed with burnout was what they told me at the time. They put me on medications for anxiety, for depression, and then diagnosed me with chronic fatigue. And then that's when we discovered the autoimmunity. And just looking at that list now from my deep dive into trauma, and also where I went to medical school, which was more focused on mind, body than perhaps other institutions, I knew that that list of my own symptoms and conditions were all related to adverse childhood experiences, all of them. And yet I do my ACE score and it's 0, 1. I do my adopted son's ACE score, 8. Right. So why is this me? This should be him. Why is this me? And that's then what led me into the next level of my study was, if this is me and I didn't think that I had trauma, then I still don't understand trauma. And why is it that the body can go through something when we're younger and we don't get sick until we're adults? Right. Is there anything I can do about it? Can I reverse this? Can I get my life back? Can I get my health back? I didn't know the answer to these questions. The conventional medicine didn't have that answer, and it certainly still doesn't have that answer. But I knew that that's what I wanted. I didn't want my life to go down this path that I had seen in all of my patients. But I didn't know if it was possible. I didn't know how to do it. So I became my own experiment and trying a bunch of different things. And as I figured out pieces, I would apply them to the kids that I was working with, the adopted kids, and then I would apply them to my patients. And I started seeing patterns. I started seeing shifts. I started seeing magic happen. And I'm like, this is incredible. This is medicine. This is why I became a doctor.
I really want to dig into that moment when you had those symptoms, because the symptoms that you're describing, we see them every day in our practice, right? You get the fatigue, the anxiety. I think you mentioned in the book some digestive issues. Then you get the autoimmune diagnosis. I mean, this is something that we see day in and day out. Most people would go to the physiological reasons for that. And we've got lots of good usual suspects, in terms of like the dietary components and the gut and toxin exposure, et cetera, that we would normally, especially here in this functional world, we would start to unpack those. But for you, you went to a very different root cause. Can you explain a little bit about that? And, when I hear that and you say, well, these things all line up. And now I know, looking at these different, this kind of pattern of conditions or symptoms, however you want to describe it, this presentation really lines up with what I see in trauma. I'm sure a lot of people listening going like, well, wait a second, I see that every day in my practice. What led you here, and how should we be thinking about this? And I know we're going to unpack some of the biological components, but just as that, like, what was it that made you go like, oh, I'm going to go in this totally different direction than everyone else in the functional space?
Margaret, we have the research that shows us what conditions and symptoms and even diagnoses are associated with adversity in your childhood. And this started with the 1980s and that very first adverse childhood experiences study with Dr. Vincent Folletti in San Diego at Kaiser, working with overweight people. Okay, not just overweight, obese people. And the program was that at that time, the United States government had decided, based on all of their algorithms, that obesity was the driving root cause of all chronic health issues. The metabolic syndrome, the cardiovascular disease, the diabetes, so all of these bad things. And oh my goodness, look at our root cause is obesity. So let's come up with a plan for obesity. So they put Dr. Vincent Folletti in charge of this, and he runs this study where he's having them drop massive amounts of weight, over 100 pounds in a year, massive amount of weight. And his most successful patients, the ones who are losing the most amount of weight, experiencing the most amount of improved health, they're dropping out of his program. They're dropping out of his program. They refuse to come back in. So he finally gets them on to have a conversation with him. He's like, what is going on? Why would you drop out? Why would you regain all of this weight? You've done so well. And they said, again, this is kind of, for me, the famous quote that changed everything was when he shared that what they told him was, what you think has been the problem has been the solution to my problem. And with that understanding, I then started looking at my own physical health symptoms that I had developed. Was my fatigue somehow a solution to the problem? And that's when I started really looking at my own patterns. And it's one of the things that I share in my book, chapter 9, as I go over the 5 patterns that people can use to recognize if their body is still holding on to trauma. Because if we can recognize the patterns, we don't wait to have them become diagnoses. We can catch them earlier and we can reroute that trajectory. But looking at fatigue, how had fatigue actually been a solution? Well, I had the pattern of, I'm only good if I'm perfect, right? I'm only worthy of love and attention if I accomplish, which means I can never stop. I can never rest. I have to keep pushing through. And I had lived my whole entire life this way. Unconsciously, I didn't realize that this is what I was doing. But then you now bring in the biology aspect and see, well, what would I have needed to do in order to keep pushing through? Well, I would have needed to rely on foods that I was sensitive to because it gave me a histamine release and the adrenaline. The adrenaline is what actually helps me pull out of that background exhaustion and get things done. accomplish things. What about the caffeine? Oh, the caffeine is great for dopamine, for adrenaline. Again, it's going to help me pull out of what is called a chronic functional freeze, or your body still holding elements of that trauma. And this is how it has the energy to rise above that, because it's hard. And so that is one of the elements that I recognize, that at that point in my life, everything felt hard. And that was then how I started to recognize my whole body is burdened down, has this burden. So everything that I do is now going to feel hard, and I'm going to have to push myself through. And I'm actually reinforcing this whole biology of trauma that's made me sick in the first place.
You do such a brilliant job of explaining these 5 very precise steps that our body takes to protect us in these moments of threat, right? And this very potent and important tipping point where we move away from the acute stress and into trauma. And this was so helpful for me. Can you walk us through at a high level those stages and kind of explain what's going on?
Yes. And I'll just mention that I struggled to know where to put that into my book, Margaret.
Did you?
And
I'm glad you started there, because it was super helpful.
I rewrote this book 7 times because it's like I needed to get it just right to be able to lead the reader through an understanding. And so it was not the first or second edition to have this be how I started the book. But I'm so glad now that this is how I started the book. I start the book with the story of Elena, and we are with Elena as she is going to have a car accident. And I walk us through, this is the moment where it's a startle, and then the stress, and then it turns into a trauma response. So let me walk you through that. The trauma response is very different than a stress response. It involves the stress response. It has to go through a stress response. Something has to be stressful for it to become traumatic. But there is a very defining line between those two. And as the body is run by the nervous system, we can watch what happens in the nervous system and how it responds to the change of our environment or situation to know whether to keep us in the stress state or move us into the trauma state. So assuming that we are driving down the road in cruising mode, maybe it's the back roads and the windows are down and it's a lovely day outside. This is when our nervous system will read the environment and say, all is good. We can be in that ventral vagal parasympathetic rest and digest mode. We're relaxed, but yet we're alive. But the moment that we realize that something might be wrong or something could go wrong, that's when our nervous system, again, it's designed to keep us alive. So it will respond very quickly and be able to put us into a startle response. For some of us, our startle response is an actual startle and we jump. For others, it may not look like that, but you will feel your energy go up. And that's exactly what happens. The sympathetic nervous system turns on, and it's aided by noradrenaline, which is the stress hormone that's already formed. It's already prepackaged. It's waiting just for the signal so that immediately it can cause your muscles to jump and be able to respond that quickly because your survival depends on it. And in that moment, you have about 15 seconds before your body decides, do I need to escalate this into a full stress response, or is everything actually okay? And that was just a startle. I do this all the time because in my creative brain, I will turn something on my stove and then walk away and forget about it. And 10 minutes later, I'm, in the zone, I'm in the flow, I'm totally in ventral vagal. And then I hear this loud pop on the stove. And I'm like, oh, right, like there's my startle. Something must be wrong. I run to the kitchen, and sure enough, something was definitely wrong. But it's not a problem that needs escalation. It didn't turn into a fire. So I take the pan off of the stove and my body can calm back down. We can come out of that and not escalate it. But if we're going to go into a trauma response, the escalation happens. And so at each step, we're escalating rather than returning back to a sense of safety. So after the startle, our body, our nervous system says, no, like this is a big problem. We need a response. And that's what the stress is for. The stress is to move us to action. Yeah. The stress is to make us respond. If we're doing anything else, like being paralyzed, that's not the stress. We've already moved into the trauma response. So really defining what is that stress physiology. It's driven by adrenaline. Cortisol isn't even on the scene yet. So don't even think about cortisol. Adrenaline is what's driving us. And as our adrenal glands are pumping out this adrenaline, its job is to release the amount of adrenaline that is needed for the size of the problem.
Right.
Now, this is going to be really key. I'm not able to tell about this to everyone because they don't understand this level of biochemistry, but for you and your audience, we're going to go here. We're going to geek out on biochemistry for a moment. So if the amount of adrenaline that's secreted is in direct proportion to the size of the danger, what if the size of that danger feels like a life threat, feels like an inescapable life threat? It feels so big and it feels so immovable that I am so small in the face of this big problem. And so our adrenal glands send out so much adrenaline, and that as that adrenaline, that amount of adrenaline surrounds our cells are like, look, I don't know who you think I am, but I am not that good. I cannot respond to that level of upregulating my cellular energy production. If it were less, I'd be able to do it. But that amount, I can't do that. And so that's what's going to differentiate between a stress and a trauma, is actually at the cellular level and the amount of adrenaline that is released in proportion to our perception of the size of the problem. And that's exactly what it is. It's our perception of the problem, not the reality of the problem, our perception of the problem. That's why we call it neuroception, the perception of our nervous system, since our nervous system is still running the show. And so this is why we can move into a sense of paralysis over things that haven't even happened yet, right. Like Margaret not liking me because she didn't like my book. Right? Like there's the story. And in my mind, for me, that would feel like, I don't know if I could survive if Margaret didn't like me anymore. Right? Now we can extrapolate this to anybody else. This is just an easy analogy because, if we start talking about our parents, our mother, our father, our siblings, well, we might actually go into a trauma response. So we're going to just keep it as me and Margaret right now. So if I have this relationship with you where my sense of safety is connected with you, yeah. And what if you didn't like me anymore? What if you left me? What if you needed to pull back? And what would I do? I wouldn't know how to survive. So for me, even though it has never even happened, even though you've never even told me that it might happen, I've still created this whole scenario and my body is like, this is a life threat. We don't know if we will be able to survive this. And this feels so big because it brings up all of my attachment issues that our body goes into a trauma response, even with things that haven't even happened yet. Because that's the essence of a trauma response, is something that feels too big for us. Mm-hmm. And it's directly related then to the amount of adrenaline that is released and our sense of ability to respond to that level of a problem. Mm-hmm. And if I don't even know what I would do, I don't even have a plan. I wouldn't even know where to start. Well, then that's part of there's no way that I can respond to this. So this is that defining moment around what then becomes a trauma from a stress, is that there is that line. In my book, I call it the wall. And the wall is where if you are running from something, whether in my book, I say it's a dog chasing you down an alley. So you're running from this dog. There's no other possible escape. And you're doing fine. You're running, you're sprinting, because like Margaret, you've been running for years. And then you come to a wall. Yeah. and there's no way around the wall. And you're looking around, and this is your moment of feeling trapped, powerless, and alone. This is your inescapable life threat. And so it's just that feeling of a wall. And we hit our internal walls all the time. And it's that moment that will shift us into the last two steps of that trauma response. So the first step is a very unique moment in our physiology. It's quite unusual because it is the only time that we have both full activation of the sympathetic system and full break on with the vagus nerve. And in that moment, you will feel the high panic because your sympathetic system is fully on, but you're not going to be able to do anything or respond. You're in that shock and paralysis moment because of the dorsal vagal break. Now, that is unsustainable, absolutely unsustainable. And so the body shifts quickly into what is that last step of the trauma response, which is the shutdown. And it feels like a collapse. This is where you might even see, if you watch movies, you'll see this all the time, right? Like there's just this collapse of their body, and they go into a surrender. And their body is surrendering in order to survive. It's not what it feels like. It feels like we're just giving in and giving up. And that's why it's so uncomfortable for us, especially as high performers and clinicians, to feel that, which is why we often will go through the stimulants and the caffeine and the food and the exercise like I did in order to not feel that background giving in, giving up, I don't care. But at the end of the day, what our nervous system has decided is that our best chance at surviving what feels unsurvivable is to surrender.
I think this is such an important distinction here, because this is the moment, of tipping into the trauma response. This is the manifestation of it. And it's the place where we have so much self-judgment around it, even though, as you so wisely point out, this is as much of a survival instinct as the fleeing, the fight, the flight, the action. And yet our body is still taking the absolute best care of us that it can in these moments. Both freeze and then the shutdown, these two, they feel very counterintuitive, the pair of them. It just, exactly as you said, it feels like giving up. I'm broken. Clearly, I'm not. With the story that we tell around this, which is probably creating even further stress and then trauma, is really profound. So can you just emphasize that again, of how this is really a protective and such a wise mechanism that our body has?
You know, as you talk about that, Margaret, I think of the patients that I watched die. And all throughout my years of general surgery, I saw a lot of patients die. I was at their bedside. This was what happened, whether this was something just because of their health condition and it was expected and they were deteriorating slowly over time, or if they were coming in from physical trauma, a car accident, some form of emergency room trauma that we were covering as the general surgery residents. Mm-hmm. And what I saw was how much the body fights to stay alive. And it's hard to describe for people who've never seen that, the wisdom that you get to see that's innate in the body, that all of the strategies that it would do in order to try to stay alive, our body fights for life. And this mechanism of freezing and then shutting down is the ultimate way it fights to survive. It is more powerful than logic. It's more powerful than any conscious decision that you can try to make. And it is more powerful than the adrenaline. And so to realize that the body has this backup survival mechanism, that if something reaches the point where there is nothing else I can do to do anything about it, to fight, to flee, to take action. If there's nothing else I can do, I have exhausted all of my resources, we're going to pull out one last attempt and we're going to give it the best attempt. And so many people, as you say, their minds don't understand this response because in essence, the body has taken over and it's left the mind behind and been like, I don't know what you're doing. I really don't care what you're doing because I've got to fight for our survival. But I hear this all of the time. And this is probably one of the more common things that I hear from women professionals when I speak at conferences. They come and they tell me, Dr. Aimie, I feel that my mind has healed. I've done all the therapy. I understand my past, its impact. I even understand my triggers. I understand my coping mechanisms. I understand it all. So why is my body still under the impact of the past? Why is my body still dealing with these health issues? And this is it, because this moment of our body taking over to survive, it disconnects the mind from the body. Yeah. And that disconnection continues throughout our lifetime unless we know how to repair that.
Hi friends, it's Margaret here with some news I am super excited to share with you. As many of you know, I am not just your podcast host. I am also the executive director of the Institute of Restorative Health. And for years, we have been getting the same request from practitioners everywhere. They'll say to me, I've heard incredible things about your clinical training programs, but I can't wait for your next certification cohort. Can I start learning now? Well, the answer is finally yes. And I couldn't be more thrilled about what this means for practitioners who are ready to transform how they approach client care. We are launching Mastering the Art and Science of Gastrointestinal Healing Core Curriculum Self-Study through the Institute of Restorative Health. This gives you immediate access to the foundational curriculum that has equipped over 1,400 certified practitioners worldwide. This is perfect if you're searching for the most effective approaches to help your clients feel better, faster, and get meaningful results. You're going to get all foundational training modules, curated Q&A sessions from previous cohorts, and dozens of real-world case studies, all at your own pace for 1 full year. Now, I want to be clear. This provides foundational knowledge and curriculum access. It's not comprehensive clinical training. You're not going to receive live instruction, the personalized mentorship, or the certification through the Institute of Restorative Health. Think of it as exploring our methodology before deciding on full certification. So for $1,400, you can dive in today instead of wondering whether our approach is right for you. And if you decide you want a complete certification experience later on, you can upgrade anytime, and we'll apply your investment towards that full certification tuition. Visit instituteofrestorativehealth.com to learn more and enroll in the core curriculum today. Your next breakthrough starts with understanding these foundations. The question is, are you ready to begin? Again, that's instituteofrestorativehealth.com. We'll see you there. I think this is a perfect moment for you to explain what is happening on a physiological level in these stages, because you make this really important distinction, as you've done so beautifully here, between the acute stress and then the ongoing trauma. And physiologically, incredibly different mechanisms are at play. So confusing the language about this has implications far beyond just semantics. It really impacts how we relate to it, how we understand it, how we have the compassion and space for understanding the process. So can you help? I know there's some big sections in your book here that I'm asking you to summarize, but I think it's so helpful to understand what is happening. You describe it at a cellular level and then at a systems level, and just how almost opposite of each other these two responses are, even though they sort of hold hands, and are almost like sister responses.
Yeah. So you're essentially asking me to explain all of chapters 4 and 5 in how many minutes? This was actually one of my favorite parts of the book to write, because this is where I get to just all hands out go into the biochemistry, which is my first love. And as we look at what's happening inside of the cells, the difference between stress and trauma becomes so clear that it helped me understand where my state was at any given moment. And let's just talk about the mitochondria, because that's really a central focus of the difference between stress and trauma. In fact, one of the things that I teach in my practitioner training is how trauma is an energy problem. So that is going to be one of the first things that we want to focus on when we're helping someone in their trauma recovery. Energy. And in a stress response, the whole purpose of the stress response is to utilize energy. The whole purpose of the trauma response will be to conserve energy. Completely different survival mechanisms. So let's talk about utilize energy. Well, to utilize energy, you have to make the energy. And then you have to send it out to where it's needed. And then that has to be able to take it in and use it. So that's all part of utilization. So at the center of this is how much energy can we make? Because that will determine the amount of stress that we can hold that won't break us, but only bend us. And so when we look at a microscope and see what the mitochondria are doing during a stress response, they respond to adrenaline and that messaging from the sympathetic nervous system as, let's hunker down. Let's hunker down because we want to make the most amount of energy possible. We also need to use the least amount of energy to make the most amount of energy. So we have to forget all of these inefficient pathways to making energy and go with glucose, energy, fast. So this is why people who are under a lot of stress will be challenged if they're trying to do a keto diet. A keto diet runs on fats, which is great when you're in ventral vagal. It's great when you are in parasympathetic. Your body is going to be like, no, I can't make energy as efficiently. And right now it's all about energy production and utilization. So it switches to carbs and fast sugars as quickly as possible. And of course, all of the other effects of adrenaline are to get more sugar into the cells for those mitochondria. But the cell membrane changes shape, the mitochondria change shape. Like this is a whole cellular response to let's give her all we've got. Let's resource her. Let's help her overcome. And we are going to upregulate our energy production to the best possible that we can, which is also why I'll just put a plug in now that our ability to respond to stress and not have it become a trauma has more to do with our readiness beforehand than it does in that moment of the stress. So it's not as much about what is actually the stress. It's more, were we ready? Were our cells ready? Were our mitochondria ready? And if they're already burdened down with toxins that are causing inefficiencies and oxidative stress, they're not ready. They can't handle anymore. And so that's when less and less stress will make us cross that line and go into a trauma response. So let's talk about the trauma response. Like what happens if at that moment our cells are like, we can't do this, whether it's because it's too much adrenaline or because it really technically isn't too much adrenaline, but we just can't make that energy because we have compromise and inefficiencies that are happening. So at that time, the mitochondria start to fall apart. They're not hunkering down anymore. Now they're just crumbling. Membranes are getting broken and proteins are getting secreted. They're going to the nucleus, which are signaling the DNA. We're shutting down. We can't respond anymore. That then changes the cellular membrane, and proteins are secreted into the extracellular matrix outside of the cellular membrane. And those proteins go to the other cells and say, we're shutting down. You should probably shut down too. And that's then how it starts to become not just a one cell, but a body system level as the whole area is recruited into this response of now moving into conserving energy. So as we look at the mitochondria, they're going into what's called the cell danger response. And this is where they literally shut down. And their whole philosophy at this point is, let's not die, but let's use as least amount of energy as possible. So it becomes a very tight line that our body walks between, well, don't die on me, but also just be barely alive. And this goes into all of the aspects around surviving what feels like unsurvivable, because if we are not breathing, the monster may not hear us. If our metabolism shuts down, and it does, well, then the monster may not sense my heat and the warmth from my body. If I am paralyzed, like I'm in that freeze moment, well, then the monster may not see me because I'm frozen, or maybe they'll become disinterested in me and go chase something that is still running around. So there's all these elements of this makes sense on an evolutionary perspective on what we see in the animal kingdom for how their bodies go into this surrender and shut down to survive. And it's the same thing for our body, as that cellular response, the mitochondrial response, actually does become a whole system response as well.
This is so interesting because, of course, in a moment like what you're describing, I mean, I think of that we all, as clinicians, we often use the like, oh, you don't perceive the difference. Your body responds the same if you're sitting frustrated in traffic as if you're running from the woolly mammoth. So of course, all of these responses make sense when you're running from the woolly mammoth, but most of us aren't actually running from woolly mammoths. Our traumas are a lot more, shall I call them, internal. And yet that response that you're talking about, which is so completely appropriate, the shutting down, the conserving of energy, that is what we then fight and caffeinate and push through and try to override this fundamental biological survival mechanism. And then we wonder why we end up even more flattened on the other end of it. I say this having no experience with this. I just hear about it.
Well, and as the clinicians that, are here in your audience, they clearly don't have any stored trauma. So
Yeah.
we're only talking about those people that they are seeing, that they're helping, and they need to know this for them,
It is really, I think this is really powerful. I think this is something that we all need to be thinking about. And you describe this loop too, and where even, the trauma experience itself can then become its own stressor and kind of feed back into this loop where we just get so stuck. It makes so much sense when we break it down like this. Of course, when you're living it and feeling it, it's, it becomes quite a, like we just sort of, we still want to, I can feel myself appreciating, hearing, acknowledging, seeing it all over my own life and still wanting to power through, right? Like that desire is, equally ingrained in us. And you have so many fantastic examples in your book of, different individuals who have, had different health manifestations and different relationship things that have come up. I could see myself in many of them.
I'll just mention that in my book, one of the stories that I share is of Laura, who had a hyper startle response. And one of the relationship challenges that she had was that she had a hard time expressing affection. And so what would often happen is that she would be up in the morning, she'd be getting her coffee, and her 3-year-old son would come up behind her. He's still half asleep, so he's, still kind of like waddling in. And then he would hug her from behind, and she'd startle and spill her coffee. And that's how so many mornings had started. And she thought this was completely unrelated, but then she would have a hard time expressing affection for her husband, Sean. And he was very open with his affection for her and would frequently tell her how he loved her. And she would go to say the words, and it would form a lump in her throat. And she loved him. She couldn't actually say the words. So this is where I am fascinated by looking at a person in their entirety and looking at their health issues and seeing what are their health issues, what are the patterns in their nervous system, like for Laura, a hyperstartle response. But then I'm also going to ask about what's going on. What is your relationship? What is your relationship with your children? Do you feel like you can really connect with them, or do you feel disconnected? Do you find yourself snapping at over spilled milk, things that are small that you wouldn't want to be responding to? And that really is one of the essence of how to recognize stored trauma in the body, is that the stored trauma affects our nervous system. And since our nervous system is what responds to stress, then it will either overreact or underreact. It will either overreact because a stress is going to trigger, kind of like poke the bear, poke the trauma that's inside, and it's going to make that problem seem bigger than it really is. We talked about perception a little bit ago. So it will make the problem seem like it's bigger than it really is. And then if we are underreacting, that is when we have that freeze response. So the freeze response, and really, whether it's freeze, shut down, or whether you want to use the term dorsal vagal, because that's how it's communicated to the vagus nerve, whatever term you want to use, it's this element of I'm underreacting because I got overwhelmed. The problem seemed so big that I got overwhelmed and I underreacted rather than being able to respond as I would have liked. So welcome back, Margaret.
Thank you. I'm so glad you kept going. So my computer just like and completely froze.
Yeah, we were just talking about your relationship problems that you mentioned, and hope you don't mind that that's, what we went into while you were gone. Felt like it was the perfect time to do that. And I just shared with them Laura's story from the book, how Laura had this hyperstartle response, and it came with this relationship aspect that she had noticed where she had such a hard time expressing affection, even though she loved her husband. It was just that like expression of it that would get stuck in her throat. So then I was just explaining how the nervous system, that dysregulation, is such one of the patterns, and will either overreact or underreact the more stored trauma that we have in our body.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for continuing going. That is a powerful example that's in the book there.
So how do you express affection for James? Do you find it difficult to express affection?
No, but I was going to ask you actually something, since we're going to go into the personal thing. There's something that I highlighted, and it's funny, in my prep for this, I put it in and then I took it out and then I put it back in again and then I took it out. And so I'm going to actually ask the question, since we're talking about something personal, because there is something that you explained a scenario that is me very much. I mean, my relationship is fantastic. I've got issues in a lot of places. That is luckily me, not one of them. So one of the things you described as somebody who had a real terror of public speaking, and you mentioned migraines, autoimmune disease, and I think there was a third thing in there. And I was like, whoa. Because while I love, for whatever reason, like being on camera, very comfortable, feels very natural to me. Even if there was 3 or 4 other humans in this room right now, only 3 or 4, let alone 3,000 or 4,000 or whatever, big stage kind of experiences, the physiological response that I have to that, I mean, I can do it. I've got my tricks. I've done the trainings, I muscle through. It's remarkable how much that is. I mean, the terror leading in, I experienced the freeze, in the day of, all I want to do is go back to bed. I'm just like, this is too much. I think I just need to nap. All day long, I'm feeling like that. Up until the moment I get on stage, the physical response is wild. And the number of times I've been on stage with an active migraine on stage because everything has tensed up to such a degree, and then the crash that comes afterwards. So when I read that in your book, I literally had to put the book down and be like, I need a minute with that. This might be something that is deeper and much bigger than just, oh, I get nervous public speaking. because a lot of people get nervous public speaking. That's very normal, but that doesn't mean that they're derailed from public speaking, which quite honestly, I don't know how many people here who are listening or on to the podcast who have seen me speak. And I don't know how much I know there have been times where it is absolutely evident that I am like devolving in front of them on stage. I hope now I've gained control of most of that. But, yeah, I'd be really curious to hear that connection was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I think that what you've highlighted is a way in which people can recognize, whether for them it's public speaking or something else, but how to actually recognize that there is something deeper there, because the amount of energy that you have to use to do that is overriding a trauma response. And so just looking at, what do I have to do? What's the amount of energy that it takes, or what's the cost of that, right? Like you then pay the cost and the crash and the letdown afterwards and the migraine and all of that, the other aspects of, there will always be a cost when we are trying to numb stuff, override our trauma response to be able to get something done that we know needs to be done. But our body says, this is a life threat. The mind, the fastest way to use the mind is just to notice when your self-talk has gone in a really negative place and be able to just shift that out. So for example, when I was creating that story about Margaret not liking me, what if I could pause and say, I have the thought that Margaret may not actually like my book. But now I've been able to put some distance between me and that. And no longer is it, I've got this fear and this is overtaking me. It's, oh, how interesting. I had the thought that. And it keeps it more manageable, and it keeps it from my body believing that it's happening. No, it's not happening. It was just a thought. And so it protects my body from experiencing it as if it were happening. So that's a little mind trick that we can do, is just label it as a thought or label it as a feeling and not as reality. Right. The other thing is your biology. And I've done some experimenting to see, like, what is the safest thing that everybody can take to help start to shift their biology of trauma into a biology of safety. And magnesium is a great place to start. Magnesium. Magnesium is one of the most critical nutrients needed for all the enzyme reactions in our body, which means that if you don't have enough magnesium, your body is going to really be in that state of deficiency, in that state of depletion, which means always on the edge of overwhelm. And so resourcing our body and our cells with magnesium, especially the forms that are more easily absorbable, chelated magnesium is great. That is an easy place and a safe place for people to start. As you say, there is so much more with the biology of trauma repair, and that's what the whole third section of the book is on. But if you're going for what are easy things that I can implement today, that would be it. Somatic self-practice, identifying something as a thought or a feeling rather than as reality, and magnesium.
Love it. Very powerful. I love it in particular. I like all three of those, but in particular, I really like that idea of when you have the thoughts, not having the thoughts, or not being the thoughts, not experiencing the thoughts, just saying, oh, look at that. I am having this feeling. I am having that thought. Just that distance. I can feel the distinction.
Isn't that lovely?
Defining yourself and just like if you just put it right there. It's still there.
Exactly. Like I can put it here on my desk and I can look at it. Oh, how interesting. That thought is interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can be curious about that thought if it's just a thought, rather than if it's me and my identity and something that's happening to me.
Right. And it's really powerful. So let's talk about the book. So your book is coming out on September 23rd. And
I got a hardcover copy. My book arrived the other day. So it is the real deal.
Dr. Aimie, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I'm really impressed by this book. I strongly recommend that everyone get it and read it. I think that it's going to change a lot of lives and help people understand the profound nature and this really profound connection between the physiological manifestations of these things that we think of as purely physiological and the trauma element, which I think a lot of us are aware it plays a role, but understanding physiologically the mechanism is it's a whole other ballpark. So I really really thank you for all of the work that you do and for supporting other practitioners and helping them with the tools to be able to support their clients. Such critical work. Thank you.
Well, this is how we share hope.
Yeah.
This is how we share hope and change the world.